One ordinary morning at Bondi Beach turned into terror when Sydney's deadly Bondi Beach shooting shattered the calm. A single dad's instinct, a billionaire CEO's vulnerability, and one split-second decision changed lives forever. This isn't just a headline, it's the moment everything almost ended. Michelle believed that mornings told the truth before the world learned how to lie. That was why he brought Ella to Bondi Beach just after dawn, when the sky was still pale and the ocean breathed slowly, like it hadn't yet decided what kind of day it would be. 6-year-old Ella sat in her stroller clutching a worn stuffed koala, her legs tucked under a pink blanket, eyelids heavy but curious. She had woken up crying again, the kind of cry that came from dreams she couldn't explain, and Michelle had done what he always did when the walls of their small apartment felt too close. He took her somewhere open. Since her mother died, routine had become his armor. Wake up early, pack snacks, check exits, count people. It wasn't paranoia, he told himself. It was love sharpened by loss. Bondi at this hour was gentle. Joggers moved like shadows along the promenade. Cafe workers dragged chairs into place. The smell of salt mixed with brewing coffee, and for a brief moment, Michelle allowed himself to believe this morning would be ordinary. A few steps ahead of them walked a woman alone, barefoot despite the cool concrete, sunglasses hiding her eyes. Her posture was straight but tired, like someone who carried invisible weight. Michelle barely noticed her at first. People came to Bondi for all kinds of reasons: escape, healing, forgetting. The woman, Rosina Vale, had sent her driver away 10 minutes earlier, craving anonymity more than safety. To the public, she was a billionaire CEO whose name moved markets and filled headlines. To herself, she was a woman who hadn't slept, whose phone buzzed endlessly with demands, and who just wanted to feel sand under her feet without being watched. She told herself this walk was harmless, 5 minutes of normal life. No boardrooms, no guards, no fear. Michelle pushed the stroller closer to the railing so Ella could see the waves, narrating softly the way he always did, pointing out seabirds and surfers as if naming them might anchor the world in place. Ella smiled faintly, her fingers loosening around the koala. Moments like that kept him going, moments where she felt safe enough to smile. He didn't see the man near the cafe at first, no one did. He blended into the background of the morning, just another figure standing still while the world moved around him. If Michelle had looked up at the right second, he might have noticed the tension in the man's shoulders, the unnatural stillness, the way his gaze wasn't on the ocean or the sky, but on people. But Michelle was adjusting Ella's blanket, and Rosina was inhaling the sea air like it might cleanse something deep inside her, and the promenade hummed with quiet life. The sky brightened, a gull cried overhead. Somewhere, a coffee grinder screamed to life. The world felt balanced on something fragile, though none of them knew it yet. Michelle's phone buzzed with a school reminder he ignored. He focused on Ella instead, on the way her hair caught the early light, on the promise he'd made himself the day he became both mother and father. Nothing would happen to her, not on his watch. Rosina slowed her pace, pausing near the edge of the walkway, removing her sunglasses just long enough to feel the wind on her face. She didn't recognize the piece for what it was. She assumed it would last. That was the mistake everyone made. The ocean rolled in and out, indifferent to names, titles, or grief. Bondi Beach had seen thousands of mornings like this, and thousands that ended differently. As Michelle pushed the stroller forward and Rosina took another step into what she thought was a harmless moment, the day held its breath, seconds away from tearing itself apart. The first shot didn't sound real, not at first. More like a sharp crack that echoed off concrete and water. The kind of noise that made people pause instead of run. And that hesitation cost precious seconds at Bondi Beach as the morning shattered all at once. Michelle felt it before he understood it, a violent jolt through the air that turned his stomach cold. And then came the second shot, unmistakable now, louder, closer, followed by screaming that rose like a wave breaking over the promenade. His body moved before his thoughts could catch up, hands yanking the stroller backward, wheels scraping hard as he dragged Ella behind a low concrete barrier near the railing, dropping to his knees and folding himself over her just as a burst of sound ripped past them and something exploded nearby. Ella cried out once, a short, terrified sound, then went eerily silent, her small hands clawing into Michelle's jacket as he pressed her head into his chest, whispering words he didn't remember choosing, promises he didn't know how to keep, his heart hammering so hard it felt like it might tear him apart from the inside. Around them, the world dissolved into chaos as people ran in every direction, some toward the beach, others back toward the street, bodies colliding, coffee cups smashing, chairs toppling as the cafe erupted into panic. Rosina turned at the sound of the first scream, confusion flashing across her face just as another shot rang out and sent shards of glass raining down from a nearby window. And in that instant, her status, her wealth, her carefully controlled life evaporated, leaving only raw fear as she saw the man near the cafe with his arm extended, the weapon unmistakable, ugly, real. She ran without thinking, bare feet slapping against concrete, breath tearing in and out of her chest, her mind screaming that this couldn't be happening here, not now, not in the open, not in daylight, but reality didn't care what made sense. Someone fell ahead of her and she swerved, nearly losing her balance as another crack split the air and a sharp impact struck metal behind her, the sound ringing painfully in her ears. Michel lifted his head just long enough to see her stumble, to see the sheer terror on her face, and something inside him hardened into resolve as another shot echoed, close enough that he felt the vibration through the ground. Without standing, without thinking, he reached out with one arm while keeping the stroller pinned behind him, grabbing Rosina by the wrist and hauling her down just as a bullet tore into the railing above them, spraying concrete dust into the air and sending fragments skittering across the ground. They hit the pavement hard, Rosina gasping as she landed beside him, the smell of gunpowder sharp and choking, Ella shaking silently between them. "Don't move," Michel said, his voice low and firm, every instinct screaming to keep them small, invisible, alive, as the sounds of chaos swirled around them, footsteps pounding, voices crying out names, someone sobbing nearby. Rosina's chest heaved as she struggled to breathe, her eyes locked not on the gunman, but on Ella, on the way the child's fingers were twisted into her father's shirt, on the way Michel shielded her without hesitation, and something inside Rosina broke open, a realization more terrifying than the bullets that had driven her here. Power hadn't prepared her for this, money couldn't stop it, control was an illusion stripped away in seconds. Another shot rang out, then another, each one punching holes through the morning as Michel stayed frozen over Ella, counting breaths, waiting for impact, every second stretching into something endless and unbearable. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the gunfire paused, leaving behind a ringing silence filled with distant screams and the echo of what had just happened, and none of them knew yet whether it was over or only taking a breath before tearing through their lives completely. For a few suspended seconds after the last shot, silence pressed down on the promenade so heavily it felt louder than the gunfire, and Michel stayed exactly where he was, body curved over Ella like a shield he refused to lift, every muscle locked, every nerve screaming that moving too soon could mean dying, while Rosina lay beside them, fighting the urge to gasp for air, her lungs burning as she forced herself to breathe quietly, shallowly, the way Michel's posture told her to. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air, sharp and metallic, mixing with salt and spilled coffee, and somewhere nearby a person was crying in a thin, broken sound that made the back of Michel's throat tighten. Ella's small body trembled under his arm, but she didn't make a sound, her silence somehow more terrifying than screams, and Michel whispered to her again and again, words tumbling out without structure, telling her she was safe even as he wasn't sure that was true yet. Rosina stared at the concrete inches from her face, noticing absurd details she would later hate herself for remembering. A dark crack shaped like a lightning bolt, a crushed paper cup rolling slowly in the breeze, the way her own hands shook uncontrollably, and she realized with a sick clarity that if Michel hadn't reached for her when he did, she would be bleeding on this pavement or worse, another headline reduced to speculation and blame. The pause stretched, filled with uncertainty, and then distant sirens cut through the stillness, faint at first, then multiplying, growing louder as they raced closer, and Michel felt a fragile shift inside his chest, not relief exactly, but the sense that time had started moving again.
Shouts followed, authoritative voices echoing from the street entrances as police poured onto the promenade, weapons drawn, commands barked sharply into the chaos, ordering people to stay down, to keep hands visible, to move only when told, and Michel complied without question, lifting his head just enough to make eye contact with an officer who nodded at him, signaling that help was coming. Paramedics rushed past moments later, kneeling beside the injured, hands already stained red, and the reality of what had happened came crashing in as Michel saw someone being loaded onto a stretcher, face pale, clothes soaked, and he swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay focused on Ella, on keeping her breathing steady, on not letting his fear infect her any more than it already had. Rosina pushed herself up onto her elbows when an officer crouched near them, her voice unsteady as she answered questions she barely processed, nodding when told she was safe now, though the word felt hollow, and she watched as Michel slowly lifted Ella into his arms, the child finally crying in earnest now that the danger seemed to be receding, her sobs tearing through him in a way bullets hadn't. He rocked her instinctively, murmuring reassurances, his hands gentle despite the adrenaline still surging through him, and Rosina felt something tighten painfully behind her ribs as she witnessed the intimacy of that moment, the raw devotion of a father holding together what little remained intact. Cameras appeared at the edges of the scene, lenses glinting, reporters shouting questions into the air, and Rosina flinched as she recognized the familiar hunger in their voices, already shaping narratives, already turning trauma into content, while Michel barely noticed them, too consumed with Ella's tears, too focused on getting her away from this place before it carved itself into her memory forever. An officer guided them toward a safer area, and as they stood, Rosina's knees nearly buckled, the delayed shock hitting her hard, but Michel steadied her without thinking, a simple gesture that grounded her more than any words could have, and she realized she didn't even know his name, only that he had chosen action over self-preservation in a moment when most people froze. Sirens continued to wail, helicopters thudded overhead, and Bondi Beach, once peaceful and sunlit, now looked torn open, littered with debris and fear, and as Michel carried Ella away from the promenade, and Rosina wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, each of them understood in different ways that whatever came next, interviews, investigations, blame, praise, none of it would erase the truth of what had just happened, that in a handful of terrifying minutes, instinct had mattered more than status, and survival had rewritten their lives in ways they could not yet begin to understand.
By the time the sun climbed higher over Bondi Beach, the morning no longer belonged to the people who had lived through it, but to cameras, speculation, and voices desperate to explain what fear never bothered to justify. And Michel felt the weight of that shift the moment an officer guided him and Ella past a growing wall of media vans and flashing lights. Reporters shouted questions that collided with one another, microphones thrust forward like weapons of a different kind, asking who he was, what he saw, how he felt, whether his daughter was okay. And Michel lowered his head, tightening his grip on Ella as she buried her face into his shoulder, overwhelmed by noise she couldn't understand, but instinctively feared. He gave no answers, only moved when told, every step away from the promenade feeling like a small victory, though his hands still shook from adrenaline and delayed terror. Nearby, Rosina stood wrapped in a gray blanket, her bare feet now smeared with dust and blood that wasn't hers, her phone vibrating endlessly in her hand as assistants, board members, and security chiefs finally realized where she was, and she felt a strange disconnect as she watched the media pivot toward her, her name suddenly shouted with urgency, Billionaire CEO caught in deadly Bondi shooting, her identity reclaimed by the world, even as she felt utterly stripped of it. Police ushered her into a waiting vehicle, shielding her from the crowd, but not before cameras caught her face, pale and shaken, an image that would be replayed across screens within minutes, dissected and captioned by people far removed from the ground she had been pressed against only moments earlier. Michel and Ella were taken to a nearby medical tent where paramedics checked them again, asking gentle questions, shining lights into wide eyes, praising Ella for being brave, and Michel nodded through it all, answering automatically while his mind replayed the sound of gunfire on an endless loop, each crack followed by the sick certainty that this was how lives ended.
Ella clung to him, refusing to let go, even when told she was safe, her small body stiff with exhaustion and shock. And Michelle wondered how much of this would stay with her, how many nights he would spend convincing her the world wasn't always like this. As hours passed, statements were released. Officials spoke of ongoing investigations and assured the public there was no further threat. And yet the atmosphere remained charged, as if Bondi itself had been bruised, its easy confidence cracked open for all to see. Social media filled with shaky videos, half-truths, and instant outrage, some people demanding answers, others assigning blame. And Michelle, watching fragments of coverage later from his small living room with Ella asleep on his chest, felt anger rise at how quickly pain became spectacle, how easily strangers' suffering was consumed and discarded. Rosina, alone in the back of a secure car speeding through Sydney streets, watched the same coverage on a muted screen, her image frozen mid-shock. And for the first time in her life, she didn't know how to manage the narrative, didn't want to, because none of it touched the truth she carried inside her, the memory of a man shielding his child, of a hand pulling her down when she would have fallen, of the realization that survival had come from instinct, not influence. Candlelight vigils formed by evening, flowers lining the promenade, handwritten notes trembling in the breeze, and officials promised reviews, reforms, and action, words that felt both necessary and insufficient. Michelle avoided the news after that, focusing instead on cooking dinner Ella barely touched, on reading the same bedtime story 3 times because she asked him to, on holding her until her breathing evened out, while Rosina sat in her penthouse overlooking the harbor, surrounded by glass and silence, unable to escape the echo of sirens in her mind. The city moved forward because cities always do, but for Michelle and Rosina, the day had split their lives cleanly in 2, before and after, and as night settled over Sydney, both understood that the hardest part wasn't surviving the shooting, but learning how to live in a world that had shown them, without warning or mercy, how fragile everything truly was.
The days after the shooting blurred together in a strange, exhausting haze, as if time itself had been bruised, and Michelle measured each hour not by the clock but by Ella's breathing, by how often she woke in the night crying, by how tightly she clung to his hand when he walked her to school, even though the route was familiar and safe. He kept the television off, the blinds half closed, determined to protect her from the endless replay of sirens and screams that now defined Bondi Beach in the public imagination. Yet fragments still slipped through, whispered by other parents, glimpsed on phones, carried in the uneasy silence of classrooms and cafes. Ella asked questions he struggled to answer: why the loud noise happened, why people ran, whether the bad man would come back, and Michelle responded with honesty softened by care, telling her that sometimes people made terrible choices, but there were also people who helped, who protected, who stayed, even when they were afraid. At night, when she finally slept, he sat alone at the small kitchen table, replaying the moment he reached for Rosina, wondering how instinct could feel so automatic and yet change so much, his hands still remembering the weight of her wrist, the jolt of concrete as they fell. Across the city, Rosina lay awake in her glass-walled penthouse, the harbor lights glittering indifferently below, her phone face down on the table after days of crisis calls, board meetings, and public statements carefully crafted by teams who spoke of resilience and unity, while she felt hollowed out by something words couldn't touch. She saw Ella's face every time she closed her eyes, saw Michelle's back curved protectively over his child, and for the first time in her career, she questioned the distance she had built between herself and everyone else, the way power had insulated her from vulnerability, until a stranger tore through that illusion with a single act of courage. She asked her assistant to find him, not for publicity, not for a thank you photo, but because she needed to understand how someone lived with fear every day and still chose to step toward danger when it mattered.
When Rosina stood outside Michelle's apartment a week later, dressed simply, no security in sight, the hallway smelled faintly of detergent and old carpet, and she felt more exposed there than she ever had in a boardroom. Michelle hesitated when he opened the door, surprise flashing across his face, but he recognized her instantly, and after a long beat, he stepped aside to let her in. They sat at the small kitchen table where Ella had drawn pictures earlier that day, crayons still scattered, the normalcy of the space grounding them both, and spoke in halting, careful sentences at first, as if afraid of disturbing something fragile. Rosina thanked him, her voice unsteady, and Michelle shrugged it off, saying anyone would have done the same, though both of them knew that wasn't true. Conversation slowly deepened, moving past the shooting into lives rarely shared. Rosina admitting the loneliness of constant vigilance, the threats dismissed as part of the job, the way success demanded distance, while Michelle spoke about losing Ella's mother, about learning to be enough for two people, about living with quiet fear long before gunfire made it visible. They drank cheap coffee and laughed softly at the absurdity of it, two strangers connected by terror and chance, finding understanding in places neither expected. When Rosina finally left, stepping back into the night without cameras or escorts, she carried something heavier than gratitude, a sense of responsibility she could no longer ignore, while Michelle closed the door and leaned against it, overwhelmed by the realization that surviving the shooting wasn't the end of the story, only the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape how both of them understood safety, courage, and what it truly meant to protect what mattered most.
Weeks passed, and yet time moved differently now, stretching and compressing in ways Michelle had never known before, as if life after the shooting existed in a softer, more cautious rhythm, each day shaped by an awareness that safety was never guaranteed, only borrowed. He returned to routine because routine was how he survived, walking Ella to school, packing lunches, reading bedtime stories. But there was a new gentleness in everything he did, a careful attention to moments that once passed unnoticed, the warmth of Ella's hand in his, the sound of her laughter when it finally returned without hesitation. Nightmares came less often, replaced by questions about bravery and choices, and Michelle answered them honestly, telling her that being brave didn't mean not being scared, it meant doing what you had to do even when you were. Lessons he hadn't realized he was teaching with his own actions until the world reflected them back at him. Rosina, meanwhile, found herself unable to return fully to the person she had been before, the decisive executive who measured outcomes in numbers and influence, because the shooting had fractured something essential, forcing her to confront the human cost behind the abstract language of risk and security. She funded trauma counseling for victims quietly, resisting the urge to attach her name to it, and pushed for public safety reforms in meetings where she once focused only on profit and growth, her resolve rooted not in public pressure, but in memory, in the image of a father shielding his child while the world fell apart around them. When she reached out to Michelle again, it wasn't with urgency or obligation, but with the simple question of whether he and Ella wanted to walk along Bondi one morning, early before the crowds returned, and he agreed after a moment's hesitation, understanding that facing the place together might loosen its grip on their minds. The dawn they met was pale and cool, the ocean calm, much like the morning that had changed everything. And as they walked slowly along the promenade, they spoke little, letting the sound of waves fill the spaces where words failed. Pausing near the small memorial where flowers had faded and notes curled at the edges, reminders that grief lingered even when headlines moved on. Ella placed a shell she had found beside the candles, solemn and thoughtful, and Rosina felt tears sting her eyes as she watched the child step back, hand slipping easily into her father's, a quiet act of trust that felt more powerful than any speech. They stood there together, not as symbols or survivors framed by tragedy, but as people learning how to carry what they had lived through without letting it define them entirely.
As the sun rose higher, casting light across the water, Michel felt a sense of closure he hadn't known he was seeking, not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer owned every thought. And Rosina felt something similar, a clarity that reshaped her understanding of success, reminding her that influence meant little if it wasn't used to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. They parted without promises, without ceremony, just a shared understanding that their lives would continue on separate paths, shaped by a moment neither could forget. And as Michel watched Ella skip ahead, laughter echoing softly across the promenade, he knew the story would stay with him, not as a source of fear, but as a reminder of what instinct, love, and choice could do in the face of violence. Bondi Beach rolled on as it always had, waves indifferent, sky vast and open. But for Michel, Rosina, and Ella, the place would forever hold the truth of how close everything came to ending, and how, against all odds, something enduring and human had survived instead.
If you felt this story, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Drew Daily Stories for powerful, emotional narratives about survival, truth, and the moments that change lives forever. New stories every day.